For 6 years, humanity lost. They lost at Corvus. They lost at Bellatrix. They lost 71 engagements in a row, and the galaxy watched, and the galaxy laughed, and the galaxy stopped being afraid. In the 7th year, Fleet Admiral Sarah Kessler sat down in front of the UN General Assembly and gave a 9-word statement. They now believe they know how we fight. Good. 11 days later, the war ended. 11 days after Kessler spoke, the Marath fleet collapsed. But the victory was never the real story. The real story was what Kessler did the moment the shooting stopped. She didn't celebrate. She didn't accept her medals. She walked into a tribunal and handed over a document she had written 6 years earlier, before humanity lost a single battle. That document calculated the exact human cost of the lie. 40,000 dead. And at the bottom, she had signed her name. The galaxy would spend decades trying to understand if she was a savior or a war criminal. Before any of this, before the 71 defeats, before the galaxy's laughter, before Sarah Kessler became the most controversial figure in human military history, she was already calculating the endgame. The war hadn't even started when she first walked into a secure room beneath Geneva and laid out a plan so cold, so ethically monstrous, that half the generals in the room tried to have her relieved of command on the spot. The year was 2137. First contact with the Marath coalition had gone catastrophically wrong. A misunderstanding over mining rights in the Bellatrix system escalated into a shooting war within 6 weeks, and humanity was dangerously outmatched. The coalition had faster ships, better shields, and a war machine that had been refining itself for 3 centuries. Earth had desperation and not much else. Kessler, then a vice admiral freshly promoted after a brilliant tour in the outer colonies, was brought into strategic command because of her reputation as a maverick. She didn't think like other officers. While her colleagues scrambled to figure out how to win a conventional war, she was already asking a much stranger question. What if losing was the only way to win? She called it teaching the enemy a language. The core idea was unnervingly simple. If a superior enemy believes they can predict your every move, they become predictable in turn. They stop improvising. They stop preparing for surprises. They build their entire war doctrine around a phantom you create for them. Then one day, you change the language completely and watch their fortress of assumptions collapse. The cost to teach that lesson, she estimated, would be horrific. She did the math in that first meeting. To make the Marath believe they understood how humans fought, Earth would have to lose. Real battles, real ships, real people. She calculated the minimum number of engagements necessary to cement the false pattern in the enemy's collective mind, and she calculated the approximate human toll. 40,000 dead, give or take, spread across 71 orchestrated defeats. The room erupted. One general reportedly shouted that she was proposing mass murder disguised as strategy. Another called it the most cynical, monstrous plan ever presented to the UN Security Council. Kessler listened to all of it, and then she said 3 words that silenced every argument. "What's the alternative?" She ran the projections. Without deception, a conventional war would cost Earth somewhere between 8 and 12 million lives and likely end in a negotiated surrender that ceded half the human sphere. With her plan, 40,000 would die on a timetable she could control. The math was brutal. The math was undeniable. The Security Council approved the plan in a sealed vote that remains classified to this day. Only 7 people knew the full scope. The soldiers sent to die at Corvus, at Bellatrix, at Lyra 6, at every one of those 71 battles, had no idea they were part of a design. They thought they were fighting their hardest and losing fairly. That was the point. The lie had to be absolute. And so, for 6 years, humanity lost. The Marath War colleges took notice immediately. By year 4, they had formally published a classified intelligence document titled The Terran Pattern, a detailed breakdown of predictable human fleet doctrine. They identified what they believed were rigid command structures, slow tactical adaptation, and a cultural aversion to unconventional warfare. They mocked it in their academies. They taught junior officers that humans were brave but hopelessly predictable. The galaxy watched the losing streak and arrived at the same conclusion. Earth was a backwater species in way over its head. Marith morale soared. Their war doctrine fossilized around a set of assumptions that had been fed to them, curated, reinforced with the blood of 40,000 human volunteers who never knew they were volunteering. And deep inside a bunker on Luna, Sarah Kessler kept a private tally. Every name, every engagement. Watching the number creep toward what she had predicted years earlier. In January of 2143, after the 71st consecutive defeat at the Battle of Proxima Gap, the Marith fleet commander issued a public statement declaring that the human resistance was effectively broken. He praised his own forces for mastering the so-called Terran weakness. He promised final victory within months. That night, Kessler sent a coded signal to the 7 others who knew. A single sentence. They've finished the course. Time to change the language. 11 days later, the war ended. But what the galaxy didn't know, what the public wouldn't learn until the tribunal hearings that followed, was that the cost Kessler estimated in year one was not a prediction. It was a line-by-line budget of lives she was willing to spend. And when she walked into that tribunal and laid down the document she wrote in 2137, with her signature already at the bottom, she answered only one question. When asked if it was worth it, she looked at the panel and said, "I don't know, ask them." Then she resigned her commission and never wore a uniform again. She vanished the morning after the tribunal. No press conference, no farewell address. Sarah Kessler walked out of that hearing room, removed her insignia, and disappeared into the civilian world with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime planning exits. Within 24 hours, the media had given her a new title, the Architect of the Lost. Some called her a monster. Others called her a hero. The only thing anyone agreed on was that she had done something no human commander had ever dared to do before, and the galaxy had no idea what to do with her. The document she left behind became an artifact of obsession almost instantly. Declassified in redacted form 6 weeks after the tribunal, the paper originally titled Teaching the Enemy a Language, a strategic framework for asymmetric engagement, was unlike any military doctrine ever produced. It was not a theoretical exercise. It was a blueprint. Kessler had named specific fleets, specific systems, and specific projected casualties. She had modeled the behavioral psychology of the Marith command structure, predicting how they would respond to repeated tactical patterns. She had even forecast the approximate date range when the enemy would fully commit to their false assumptions and become vulnerable to a sudden doctrinal shift. The paper was dated March 4th, 2137, 3 weeks before the Marith coalition fired the first shot. The war hadn't started, and she had already written its ending. Buried in Appendix D, on a page marked Projected Attrition Threshold, was the number 40,000. Even the UN's own censorship team couldn't redact it fast enough to stop it from leaking. The public seized on that figure with a kind of horrified reverence. It was a price tag, coldly calculated and signed by its author. The question that echoed across every newsfeed, every debate, every dinner table argument, was whether a leader who could write down 40,000 deaths in advance and still execute the plan was a strategic genius or a sociopath. The answer depended entirely on who you asked, and whether they had lost someone in one of the 71 battles. For the families, the revelation was a wound that refused to close. One of the first to speak publicly was Elena Vasquez, whose younger brother Miguel had served as a gunnery officer on the Hastings, a destroyer lost in the 5th year of the war at the Battle of Vega Gap. Elena had accepted her brother's death with the hollow comfort that he had died fighting a superior enemy in a fair fight. When the truth emerged that the Hastings was deliberately positioned in a weak flank, its sacrifice scripted to reinforce the Marath belief in human tactical rigidity, her grief transformed into a rage she carried into every interview she gave. She wasn't alone. A coalition of bereaved families formed an advocacy group with a name that Kessler herself might have written, the 40,000. They filed lawsuits, demanded full declassification, and called for criminal proceedings. They wanted the world to see the names behind the number, to force the public to understand that each of those 40,000 was a person, not a line item. But there were other voices too. Captain Li Wei, a survivor of the Bellatrix engagement who had lost both legs when his cruiser was torn apart by Marath broadsides, gave a press conference that stunned everyone. He held up a photograph of his crew, 42 faces, and said that every single one of them had sworn an oath to protect humanity. He argued that Kessler had given their deaths meaning far greater than a conventional war ever could have. "She made us the bait," he said, "but the trap caught a galaxy. I would crawl back into that ship and do it again." His endorsement fractured the narrative. This wasn't a simple story of a villain and her victims. It was a mirror held up to the ethics of survival. The Marath coalition, meanwhile, did not fade quietly into diplomatic obscurity. The speed of their defeat had been so absolute, so humiliating, that their war councils fractured along ideological lines within weeks. A radical faction known as the Unbroken Talon issued a formal declaration condemning human deception as a violation of what they called honorable engagement doctrine, a concept that, until then, no human had ever heard of. They demanded Kessler be extradited to face Marath justice for crimes of perfidy. The request was rejected by the UN, but it ignited a tense diplomatic standoff that simmered for years. The Talon did not forget. They circulated propaganda across the outer colonies, painting Kessler not just as a war criminal but as the embodiment of human treachery. They wanted her dead, and they were patient. Kessler herself stayed silent through all of it. She refused interviews, avoided public appearances, and reportedly moved to a small settlement on a colony moon so remote that it didn't even have a name on most star charts. She lived alone, reading declassified reports and tending a garden that neighbors said was the only thing she seemed to care about anymore. The woman who had orchestrated the most audacious deception in military history wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. But the galaxy was not finished with her, and neither was the truth. In late 2145, 2 years after the tribunal, a sealed archive from the original planning sessions was accidentally released to the public as part of a broader transparency initiative. The files included internal communications among the 7 who knew, and one document in particular changed everything. It was a handwritten note, penned by Kessler herself, dated 6 months into the war. She had been tracking the actual casualty figures against her original projection, and the real number was already higher than she had estimated, by a significant margin. The war was only a quarter over and the death toll had already surpassed 20,000, far outpacing her predicted curve. In the margin, she had written a single sentence. The model was wrong. Continue anyway. The implication was devastating. If the attrition threshold was already broken, then the entire strategic justification for continuing the deception was gone. But she kept going. The remaining 50-plus engagements were fought not because they were necessary, but because she could not bring herself to stop what she had started. The cost had been paid, and she needed to see the payoff, even if it meant sacrificing thousands more than her own math demanded. When that note leaked, the fragile public consensus shattered completely. The hero narrative died overnight, but the real bomb was yet to come. In the same sealed archive, buried in a folder marked Post-Conflict Assessment, There was a report from ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, that Kessler herself had never seen. It contained an analysis of Marath after-action reports recovered from their fleet archives after the surrender. The report concluded that the Marath war colleges had actually begun to suspect the deception as early as year 5, but their command structure had suppressed those warnings, because admitting they had been fooled would have been politically catastrophic. The entire final 2 years of the war, tens of thousands of human soldiers died to reinforce a pattern the enemy already half knew was fake. The greatest deception in galactic history was, in part, a deception of the deceivers. The one person who didn't know was Sarah Kessler. The revelation landed like a kinetic strike. If the Marath suspected, then the deaths after year 5 were pointless. The moral calculus Kessler had clung to, however brittle, now crumbled into dust. She had killed people to sell a lie that the customer had already stopped fully believing. The news reached her in exile through a single encrypted message from a former colleague who thought she deserved to know before the public found out. She read the ONI report in silence, according to the only neighbor who dared to speak about it later. Then she went back to her garden and didn't come out for 3 days. When she finally emerged, she began writing again. Not a defense, not an apology, but something else entirely. No one knew what it was, but word spread that Kessler was preparing to break her silence. And a week before she was scheduled to release whatever she had written, the Unbroken Talon announced that they had located her. They promised that the architect of the Lost would face Marath justice within the month. The clock was ticking on the galaxy's most wanted woman, and she was about to speak for the first time in 3 years. She broke her silence from a place no one expected. There was no press conference, no leaked manifesto to a sympathetic journalist. Instead, at dawn on a Tuesday, every major comm relay in the human sphere went dark for 11 seconds. When they came back online, a single file had been deposited onto every public data node. The file was titled simply Correction. The author was Sarah Kessler. It opened without greeting or context, just a dry, operational tone that anyone who had read her original strategy paper would recognize immediately. She explained that the ONI report was incomplete. The Marath suspicion in year 5 was not a failure of the deception itself. It was a leak. Someone inside the Seven had been feeding the Marath just enough information to keep their doubts alive, but not enough to change their doctrine. A careful drip of ambiguity that extended the war for 2 more years, not because the Marath refused to admit they were fooled, but because a human being was deliberately prolonging the slaughter. She didn't name the person in the initial transmission. She said the evidence was contained in an appendix that she had encrypted and split across 7 off-world servers, each requiring a separate biometric key from a different custodian she had chosen in advance. It was a dead man's switch. If anything happened to her, the keys would self-destruct, and the truth would die with her. The 7 custodians did not know each other's identities. The architect had architected one last contingency. The galaxy went into convulsions. News outlets ran the headline, "The Mole of the Seven," before the first hour was out. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session within 2, and by the evening, the Secretary General herself was on record calling Kessler's claims unfounded and dangerously destabilizing. But Kessler had anticipated that too. She included a secondary file, accessible only to a handful of independent journalists with the right clearance tokens, containing partial communication logs between the Mole and Marath handlers. The metadata was authentic, verified by third-party cryptographers within minutes. The logs showed tactical updates on human fleet dispositions, psychological profiles of the other 6, and most damning, a specific instruction to stall the Marath High Command's early attempts to adapt by feeding them assurances that the human pattern was genuine. The mole's motivation was not ideology but leverage, post-war power in a human government that would owe its survival to the inside player who kept the enemy complacent. Kessler, in her exile, had spent 3 years pulling apart her own conspiracy, tracing the threads backward from the casualty anomalies she had noticed during the war but never pursued. She now admitted that she had suspected something was wrong as early as year 4 when the attrition curve began to deviate, but she told herself it was statistical noise. The handwritten note, "The model was wrong. Continue anyway," was a confession not of arrogance but of self-deception. She had chosen not to look deeper because she was afraid of what she would find. She had killed those extra thousands because she lacked the courage to question her own plan while it was in motion. The confession was devastating because it inverted the moral equation. The public had spent the last 3 years arguing whether Kessler was a monster for following the original math or a hero for making the hard call. Now she was telling them that the math was sabotaged, that the call was corrupted by a traitor, and that her greatest crime was not the 40,000 deaths she signed for, but the silence that let them become 50, 60, 70,000. She had been a weapon aimed by someone else, and she had never checked the targeting data. The unbroken Talon, however, did not care about nuance. The night after the transmission, a Marath strike team breached the perimeter of the colony moon where Kessler had been living. Neighbors later described a sound like tearing metal and a flash of violet light that turned the garden she had so carefully tended into a crater of fused glass. But Kessler was already gone. She had moved from that location weeks earlier, anticipating the assault. The transmission had been routed through so many relays that even the most advanced forensics could not pinpoint her real position. The broadcast served a dual purpose. It not only exposed the mole, but also forced the Talon into the open. By announcing their intention to capture her, they had made themselves the visible antagonist. Kessler was betting that the public, once they understood the full story, would see her as something other than a monster. And she was right, at least partially. The advocacy group of bereaved families, the 40,000, did something no one predicted. They issued a statement of conditional support. They did not forgive her. They made that explicitly clear. But they acknowledged that the true architect of their loved ones' meaningless deaths was not Kessler but the unknown mole who had hijacked the plan for personal gain. They demanded the mole's name and Kessler's protection. The fracture inside the UN deepened. Hardliners argued that Kessler's allegations were a cover for her own culpability, that the logs could be forged, that she was a criminal who should be turned over to the Marath to ease tensions. The Secretary General privately pressured intelligence agencies to discredit the data, but someone inside the Office of Naval Intelligence, perhaps conscience-stricken, leaked a corroborating memo that confirmed the existence of an internal investigation into the very communication anomalies Kessler had cited. That investigation had been shut down on orders from the top. The traitor was not a low-level operative. It was someone with the authority to strangle an internal probe. Then, 2 days after the initial broadcast, Kessler released the name. She did it live, piggybacking onto the Emergency Council session's own holostream. One moment the Secretary General was denouncing her as a destabilizing force. The next her voice cut through the feed, calm and clinical, addressing the Secretary by her first name. She named Admiral Thomas Hargrove, Chief of Naval Intelligence, the very office that had produced the incomplete ONI report, and the man who had stood beside the Secretary at every public memorial, his medals glinting, his grief performative. The logs matched his bioprint. The encrypted appendix, now unlocked by 3 of the 7 custodians, revealed the full scope. Hargrove had delayed the Marath adaptation by feeding them false confidence, while siphoning post-war contracts to shell companies he controlled. The extra 2 years of war had enriched him personally, by an estimated 4.7 billion credits. The 40,000 became 70,000, and Hargrove had paid for it with other people. The revelation broke something in the human sphere that could never be mended. The man the public had trusted, the face of intelligence that had supposedly helped win the war, was the parasite at its heart. Hargrove was arrested within hours by subordinates who refused his order to destroy evidence. His trial would become the longest and most contentious in human history, but that was Act 3. Right now, the immediate consequence was that Kessler had just declared war on her own government in order to finish the job she had started. The Talon, seeing their opportunity, escalated. They didn't just want Kessler now. They wanted Hargrove too, arguing that his crimes made the entire human victory illegitimate and the surrender treaty void. The Mareth factions who had always opposed the peace treaty began mobilizing. The fragile galactic order tilted toward collapse, and the one person who stood at the center of it all had gone from being a disgraced admiral to being the only one holding the proof of why the war had really lasted so long. And then, from the encrypted appendix, one final piece emerged. A note from Hargrove to his Mareth contact, dated 2 months before Kessler made her infamous statement in front of the General Assembly. It read, "Kessler is about to flip the script. Do not react. Let her end the war. The longer it lasts, the more I weaken. I need the peace to cash in. Stall your high command just a little longer and we both get what we want." That meant the 11-day victory, the glorious climax of her grand deception, was allowed to happen by the same man who had been bleeding humanity dry. The triumph was real, but the cost could have been stopped years earlier. Kessler, reading that note, had learned that her greatest success was a gift from her greatest betrayer. She ended her broadcast with a single sentence that echoed her tribunal words, but with a difference only the attentive would catch. She said, "Ask them, and this time, ask the right question." Then the feed cut, and the galaxy was left to find her before the Talon did, before her own government did, and before the truth consumed everything. The hunt for Sarah Kessler began in earnest about 40 minutes after her broadcast went silent. Not just by the unbroken Talon, who had already demonstrated their willingness to strike civilian colonies to get her, but by her own government. The Secretary General issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of treason, sedition, and unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence. It was a desperate move, and everyone knew it. The government was circling the wagons around Hargrove, hopping to bury the truth under procedural chaos, but Kessler had outmaneuvered them again. She had already embedded the encrypted appendix with the 7 custodians, and she had timed the release of information so that each new revelation would land precisely when the public outrage began to fade. She was orchestrating the aftermath as carefully as she had orchestrated the war. Hargrove was arrested within hours of the broadcast, but he did not go quietly. Holocam footage leaked from the detention center showed him in full dress uniform, medals gleaming, demanding to speak to the Secretary General and insisting he was the victim of a smear campaign by a disgraced admiral. It didn't work. By the following morning, a cascade of internal audits had uncovered the shell companies, the off-world accounts, the contracts that had funneled 4.7 billion credits into his personal holdings during the final 2 years of the war. The money was traced to Mareth intermediaries who had no idea they were funding a human traitor. They believed they were paying for genuine intelligence assets. The corruption was so brazen that even Hargrove's staunchest allies in the Security Council abandoned him within 72 hours. But Kessler wasn't finished. She released a segment of her personal journal, written during the war and kept encrypted in a data cache that even Hargrove had never found. In it, she described the moment she learned that her only son, Lieutenant Daniel Kessler, had been assigned to the Hastings, a cruiser she knew was slated for a sacrificial role in the Battle of Vega Gap. She had the power to reassign him, and she wrote about that choice. No one else knew. She could have pulled him out without compromising the operation, but she decided that if the plan required other mothers and fathers to lose their children, she could not exempt her own. She signed the deployment order herself, and on the day the Hastings was destroyed, she logged a single sentence. The number now includes Daniel. Continue anyway. When this entry became public, the public conversation shifted completely. The families of the 40,000 had been Kessler's most relentless critics, but now they faced an impossible reckoning. She had not sent their loved ones to die while sitting safely behind a desk. She had sent her own. The moral equation now included a line item that no one could have anticipated. Elena Vasquez, the sister of Miguel Vasquez who died on the Hastings alongside Daniel Kessler, released a statement through her advocacy group. She said, "I still cannot forgive her, but I now understand that she did not ask us to pay a price she was unwilling to pay herself." It was not absolution, but it was recognition, and it changed the legal and political calculus around Kessler's extradition. The Mareth response was equally fractured. The moderate faction that had negotiated the original surrender treaty distanced itself from the unbroken Talon, condemning the attempt on Kessler's life as a violation of diplomatic norms. But the Talon, now backed by hardline elements in the Mareth military, declared that they would not accept any human narrative that painted Hargrove as a rogue actor. They insisted that the deception had been a conspiracy of all human leadership, and they renewed their demand for Kessler's extradition, as well as Hargrove's, to face Mareth tribunals. What happened next was a diplomatic standoff that nearly reignited the war. Mareth battle groups began massing near demilitarized zones, citing the need to apprehend war criminals. Human forces mobilized in response, and for 3 terrifying weeks, the galaxy held its breath. Then Kessler did something that no strategist could have predicted, and which historians now regard as the final act of her grand design. She never fled. She never went deeper into hiding. Instead, she transmitted a set of coordinates to a neutral party, a journalist who had covered the war from the beginning and who was trusted by both the families and the military. The coordinates led to a small, abandoned observatory on a moon in the outer reaches of human space, and when a small delegation arrived, they found her sitting alone at a console, surrounded by data slates and a single photograph of her son. She was not armed. She was not defiant. She was ready to answer the question. The meeting was not a trial. It was not an arrest. It was, at her insistence, a conversation with representatives of the families whose loved ones had died in the 71 battles. She sat across from them for 6 hours, answering every question, nomming every system, explaining the logic behind each engagement. She showed them the original projections and the real casualty data, laid side by side, and she admitted that the extra deaths after year 5 were the result of her failure to detect Hargrove's sabotage. She did not ask for pity. She did not ask for forgiveness. When Elena Vasquez asked her directly, "Was it worth it?" Kessler looked at the photograph of her own son for a long moment and then said, "I don't know. But the war ended in 11 days instead of 11 years, and that equation kept another 8 million human beings alive. I tell myself that your brother and my son are part of that 8 million. I don't know if that's true, and I will spend the rest of my life not knowing. That is the only thing I can offer you." The meeting remained private, but details leaked. The consensus was that Kessler had not given the families what they wanted: certainty, closure, a clean moral victory, but she had given them something rarer: absolute transparency. The families, through their representatives, issued a statement that they would not support extradition to the Mareth, and they urged the UN to drop its charges. The political pressure was now overwhelming. Hargrove's trial, by contrast, provided no such ambiguity. It was a long, ugly affair, lasting nearly 2 years, but the evidence assembled by Kessler's custodians proved unassailable. He was convicted on 17 counts of treason, corruption, and conspiracy, and sentenced to life in isolation. He never expressed remorse. His final courtroom statement was a rant about historical forces and the necessity of strong leadership. No one remembered it. What they remembered was the testimony of a junior intelligence analyst who had been ordered to falsify the ONI report that Kessler later uncovered. The analyst, a young woman named Priya Okonkwo, had kept a copy of her original findings, the ones that showed Marath's suspicions in year 5, and had been waiting for years for someone with enough authority to listen. She broke down on the stand when asked why she hadn't come forward earlier, and she said, "Because Admiral Kessler was the only person in the chain of command who would have acted on it, and she was already gone. I thought no one else would care." The courtroom was silent. It was clear in that moment that Kessler's greatest miscalculation had not been the original plan, but the assumption that people of conscience would fill the void she left. In the end, the Talon's threat evaporated, but not because of any legal outcome. The death blow came from within the Marath coalition itself. An internal investigation, launched in response to the scandal, revealed that the Talon's leadership had known about Hargrove's payments for more than a year and had accepted bribes themselves to keep the war going. The revelation was so damaging that the coalition's High Council censured the Talon and dissolved its charter, ordering its leaders arrested. The faction that had once sworn to capture Kessler now scattered into irrelevance, its surviving members hunted by their own people. The irony was not lost on human commentators. The Marath had finally learned what it felt like to discover a traitor at the heart of a war they thought they understood. Kessler did not attend any of these proceedings. She did not testify at Hargrove's trial, nor did she accept any public role in the rebuilding. She answered the family's questions, and then she disappeared again, this time for good. There were no more broadcasts, no more dead man switches, no more revelations. She walked out of that observatory and into a silence so complete that even the most determined journalists eventually gave up the search. For years, the only clue to her whereabouts was a small, anonymous donation made each year on the anniversary of the Battle of Vega Gap to a scholarship fund named for the fallen crew of the Hastings. The donations were never traceable, but the timing was exact. She died 17 years later in a remote coastal settlement on a world that was barely colonized, under an assumed name. A neighbor found her in her garden, seated in a chair facing the sea, a worn copy of her original strategy paper in her lap. The paper was annotated in her own handwriting, with thousands of marginal notes, but the final page contained only one addition. Next to the number 40,000, she had written the actual total, 73,412. Below that, she had added 3 words. I counted them. The note was never made public, but the neighbor who found it later gave an interview in which she said that Kessler's expression in death was peaceful, as though she had finally been allowed to put down a weight she had been carrying for far too long. The woman who had taught an enemy a language, who had sacrificed her own son to make a lie credible, who had dismantled her own government to expose the truth, had written her own elegy in a single line. The galaxy would spend the next century debating her legacy, but she had already said everything she needed to say. The right question had finally been asked, and perhaps, in that quiet garden by the sea, she had at last found an answer she could live with, even if she had to wait until the end of her life to hear it. Sarah Kessler remains a wound in the memory of the galaxy that has never fully healed. The question she left behind is not whether she was right or wrong. That debate will outlive every person alive today, but whether a civilization can survive the kind of moral clarity she embodied. She saw a problem, she did the math, and she acted, knowing that the cost would be counted in human lives, and knowing that she would be the one who had to count them. Most leaders delegate that burden to history. Kessler carried it herself in a garden by the sea with a list of names that haunted her until the end. Her legacy is a mirror. When we look at it, we see not just the woman who taught an enemy a language, but the uncomfortable truth that survival sometimes demands choices that no ethical system can comfortably hold. The 71 defeats, the 40,000 dead, the extra years of war bought by treachery, all of it happened inside a framework that she built, and all of it saved millions. That does not make it clean. That does not make it good. It makes it real, and reality has never been obligated to offer us satisfying moral arithmetic. The real cost of Kessler's plan was not the lives it spent. It was the questions it forced the living to ask about themselves. Are we, as a species, willing to pay that price again? Are we willing to accept leaders who can stare into the abyss and make decisions that will destroy them from the inside? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if we are not, then who will make those decisions when they must be made? Kessler never gave an answer because she knew the answer was not hers to give. She only made sure that the question would outlast her, and it has. The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do. New wars were fought, new alliances formed. The Marith coalition eventually became a cautious trading partner, its old grievances buried under generations of pragmatic diplomacy. Human history absorbed the Kessler affair into its textbooks, sanitized for classroom consumption, stripped of its sharpest edges. But among the families of the 73,412, and among the soldiers who survived because the deception worked, her name still carries a weight that official histories cannot capture. She is a reminder that the line between heroism and horror is not a line at all, but a place where people are asked to make decisions that no human being should ever have to make. If this story stayed with you, if it left you unsettled in a way that feels important, then you have already begun to understand why we told it. Not to celebrate Sarah Kessler, not to condemn her, but to hold up the mirror she left behind and to sit with the discomfort it creates. These are the kinds of stories we believe need to be told, not the stories that offer easy answers, but the ones that demand better questions. If you want to see more, hit subscribe now. We'll be here, asking the questions that the galaxy would rather forget.